for myself when I'm invited or when I'm approached to make this intervention in someone else's space. And the first condition for me, and I think that word condition we've heard a few times today, the first condition for me is that when creating work in a public space, I have to recognize, well, I already said it, that I'm the outsider there. And that quite often when I make the work, I'm radically altering a space that someone's already used to. Maybe they pass there every day, maybe they take the kids to school, maybe whatever, they come there to picnic or whatever, and suddenly there's something else there. It doesn't matter how subtle it is, it still alters the experience of a space that they're already familiar with. So I have to recognize that I'm about to do that. The second condition is to recognize that the process of arriving at the work, well, Tanya and I already had a little tiff over that. So, I was going to say that the process of arriving at the work is often not very democratic. So I also come with that understanding that even when I have consultations and so on and so forth, in most instances, there's a delegate group of people, a small delegate group of people who vet the idea on behalf of the community or on behalf of the patron or on behalf of some other organization. So it's not like you have a parliament of people who always have to go through. And this, of course, historically has caused problems where in certain instances, two works have had to be made for the same project. Where, like the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., where the artist made her work, and then the veterans and so on, or at least some very vocal section of the veteran community, insisted that another work had to be made. So she made this, what I consider probably the greatest war memorial of the 20th century. But then they wanted some bronze sculpture of American soldiers fighting in Vietnam. So they actually have two works at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. So I have to bear in mind that the small group of people who are looking at my proposal do not necessarily represent the entire community and their point of view. And the third condition for me is to know the space. I think most artists do that. Some artists don't because they bring ideas that could fit anywhere. But some of us do try to know the space. And for me, knowing the space is about knowing as much as I can. Going back to the word research, doing the research, knowing the history, knowing the logistics of movement and the space, knowing who is connected to the space, going back, in fact, as far as possible as I can with the history. And this is one of the interesting things with the work that I made for Documenta in 2017, was that I actually went back several centuries to the history of Kassel itself. I went as far as 15-something, the 16th century, looking at the history of the square and of the city and of the politics before proposing the work. Of course, all of that, an attempt was made to overwrite all of that, when we ran into political trouble. But I think that knowing that this is rooted in a certain, not necessarily profound, but a certain considerable knowledge of the space and the circumstances, it sort of enables you, empowers you to a certain degree to then confront certain interests in the community that may not know as much as you do. And in fact, in this particular case, I don't think that the people that we were dealing with knew half as much about the space as I did from the research that we did. So it's important for me, not out of, not because I can know everything about the space, but it's important to know as much as I can. And it's not about owning the space, because I can't really own a space where I come in for a couple of months or maybe a year or whatever, and the people have been living there forever, you know? It's like moving into a new house, and people have been living in that house. They were born there, for instance, and you think you know better than they do. You can't possibly. So that's another condition, is for me to study as a student, with modesty, with curiosity more than everything else, you know, with a desire to know as much as possible about how that space came to be, what's underneath the dust in the space, and how it operates. And the third condition for me is to anticipate, like we already heard, that different members of the community are going to have different responses to the work. There'll be those who will receive it, and there'll be those who will ignore it, and there'll be those who will probably oppose it. So anticipating that does help. Every now and then you get instances of artists who make work in public spaces, and when I talk about public spaces, actually, I'm not just talking about the square in the middle of the town. It includes the gallery as well, because when the work leaves your studio, it enters a public space. And you get instances where artists are shocked, or they're surprised by the response. Hello, you ought to anticipate certain things, you know, because you're stepping into someone else's space, and not everyone is going to even understand what you're trying to do. And sometimes the vehement response is not because they want to oppose or that they resent. It's simply that they don't understand what this is about. So anticipating differences in reception is important for me as a condition. And then following up on all of these is to recognize that a communal or public space is essentially a political space. And it's in the term itself, public and political, the same word. It's all from people. And it doesn't matter what work you make in the public space. The space itself is political. So you have to be as prepared as possible and as flexible in terms of anticipating and in terms of taking in differences of response and opinion. Not necessarily agreeing, and not necessarily, I'm not talking about consensus here, because there's probably never any consensus, but knowing that this is a political space where you're making an intervention. You know, then with all that in mind, I think that the final condition for me is to find a way to create a sense of ownership. This is political, really. This is politically convenient, because when people have a sense of ownership, they're less likely to oppose, and they're less likely to reject. They're less likely to vandalize. In fact, when they see someone vandalizing the work, they take offense, because they now have a sense of ownership of the work, whether they were part of making it or not part of deciding it or whatever. If there's somehow that they can key into some resonance, some profound resonance that allows them a sense of ownership, then you feel like the work is not only safe, and safety can be important sometimes with some of these works, not always, but sometimes, but that people will go out of their way to also defend the work and to enjoy the work and to activate the work and to give it even new possibilities that you did not anticipate in your own vision of the work. So with all that in mind, I think, again, that was the other surprise about the controversies some of you may read about or know about concerning my work for documentaries, that I don't think that the politicians that we had to deal with understood that I understand this about public art or interventions in communal spaces. It wasn't the first time that I was making such a work, and it wasn't, you know, the first place.